Outlaw found a young mother and her dying child trapped in a killer blizzard, with death already knocking at their door. But Jake, Blackjack Morgan, was 3 days ahead of the hangman's noose, with a dead teller's blood on his hands, and the last thing this cold-hearted killer needed was a reminder of everything he'd lost his soul trying to forget. Partner, saddle up and subscribe for more gritty Western tales. And tell me down in the comments, would you trade your freedom to save a dying child? Jake, Blackjack Morgan, had been riding hard for 3 days straight, pushing his Mustang through mountain passes that would break most men in fair weather. The blizzard came down like the devil's own wrath across Colorado territory, turning the world white and deadly. Behind him, somewhere in that wall of white, Sheriff Wade Garrison and his posse were hunting him down like a mad dog. The bank job in Denver had gone to hell faster than spit on a hot skillet. What should have been easy money turned into blood money when that damn fool teller reached for a hidden gun. Jake had put 2 bullets in the man's chest before his conscience could stop his trigger finger, grabbed what cash he could reach, and rode out with the sound of a dying man's wife screaming his name to the heavens. Now Jake, Blackjack Morgan, was worth $500 dead or alive to every badge-wearing son of a gun in the territory. He'd killed plenty of men before, but they'd all been playing the same deadly game he was. The teller had just been trying to protect money that wasn't even his own, probably had young ones at home waiting for Papa to come back from work. His horse was dying beneath him, each step slower than the last, foam freezing around the bit. The animal had given everything it had and then some, but even the strongest Mustang couldn't run forever through snow this deep. Jake needed shelter, needed rest, needed to get out of this white hell before it claimed them both. That's when he saw it through the swirling snow. A wagon tilted sideways like a broken toy, half buried in a drift that had probably been building for hours. The canvas top sagged under the weight of ice and snow, and nothing moved around it except the wind. Jake pulled his dying horse to a stop, every instinct screaming danger. In country like this, a broken wagon could mean anything. Could be a trap set by lawmen who'd figured out his trail. Could be road agents or claim jumpers looking for easy pickings. Could be worse things, the kind that left men's bones scattered across the snow come spring thaw. But then he saw the hand, tiny, pale as fresh snow, reaching out from under the canvas of the wagon like it was grasping for help that would never come. A child's hand, and it wasn't moving. Jake swung down from his horse, boots sinking deep into snow up to his knees. The cold bit through his coat like hungry wolves, and his breath came out in white clouds that disappeared as fast as his chances of reaching Mexico alive. But something about that still little hand made him move forward, even when every smart bone in his body told him to ride on. He pulled back the canvas with hands that shook from more than just cold. Inside the wagon, huddled together like scared rabbits, he found them. A woman, maybe 25, with chestnut hair that had come loose from its pins, and a face pale as death itself. In her arms, wrapped in every blanket and coat they owned, was a little boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The boy was burning up with fever, his little face flush red as summer roses, breathing coming in short, desperate gasps. His lips had a blue tinge that he'd seen before on men dying from lung fever, and his small body shook with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. The woman was out cold, but alive. He could see her breath, shallow but steady, forming tiny clouds in the freezing air. Her hands were locked around her son, like even in sleep she was trying to protect him from a world that wanted to take everything she had left. He touched her neck, feeling for the pulse his outlaw life had taught him to find in dying men. It was there, weak but fighting, like a candle flame in a hurricane. She was alive, but not by much. Without help, without warmth, without medicine, she and the boy would be dead before dawn painted the eastern sky. He could see what had happened. The wagon's front wheel had snapped clean through, probably hit a hidden rock or fallen tree under all this snow. The wagon had tilted over, spilling most of their supplies across the white ground where the wind had already buried them deep. What food he could find was frozen solid. What water they had carried was ice. Jake stood there in the howling wind, staring at two people who were going to die if he didn't help them. The smart play was clear as day. Take their horse if it was still alive, take whatever supplies he could dig out of the snow, and keep riding south. He was an outlaw, not a nursemaid. He had his own hide to save. But the boy's face reminded him of someone. His nephew Billy, his sister's boy, dead these 5 years from the same lung fever that was killing this child. Billy had been 4 too, with the same brown hair, the same small hands that trusted the world to keep him safe. Jake had been locked up in Yuma prison when Billy died, doing time for robbery, while his sister wrote letters he never got until it was too late to matter. Jake, Blackjack Morgan, made his choice. He lifted the woman as carefully as his rough hands knew how, feeling how light she was, how cold her skin had become. She stirred slightly, mumbling something that might have been a prayer or just a mother's desperate plea for her child's life. Then he took the boy, lifting him with the kind of gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had spilled so much blood. The child was burning up, his small body giving off heat like a tiny furnace, but he was shivering so hard his teeth chattered like castanets. His horse could barely carry Jake's weight anymore, let alone 3 people. But the animal was all they had. Jake settled the woman and child as best he could, then took the reins and started walking, leading the horse through snow that got deeper with every step. They moved like ghosts through the white world, Jake breaking trail on foot while his horse carried its precious cargo. Every step was pure hell, snow finding its way into his boots, wind cutting through his coat like it was made of paper. But he kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant death for all of them. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Jake's strength was fading fast. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burned with each breath of the bitter air, and his horse was stumbling more with every step. But behind him he could hear the woman beginning to stir, could hear her soft voice as she realized someone was carrying her and her son to safety. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "What happened to our wagon?" Jake didn't look back, just kept walking. "Wagon busted a wheel," he said, his own voice rough from cold and bone-deep tiredness. "You and the boy were dying, still might if we don't find shelter soon." "My son," she said, and Jake could hear the terror in her voice, the same fear every mother carried when her child was in danger. "Is he—" "He's alive," Jake said. "Fevered bad, but alive." "What's his name?" "Cody. His name is Cody. And I'm Sarah Garrison." She paused, studying Jake's profile as he walked beside the horse. "You're risking your life for strangers. Why?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, focusing on the trail ahead, on the impossible task of finding shelter in this white wilderness. "Because somebody should. Because a boy shouldn't die just because the world's a hard place." Just when Jake thought his legs couldn't carry him another step, when he was ready to admit that all 3 of them were going to die in this frozen hell, he saw it. Lights, warm and yellow, flickering through the snow like stars that had fallen to earth. A town, small but real, its windows glowing with the promise of heat and shelter and maybe, just maybe, hope. Cedar Gulch wasn't much of a town, just a handful of buildings huddled together against the mountain cold like people gathering around a campfire. But it had a doctor's shingle hanging over one door, a general store that might have medicine, and a hotel that could provide beds and warmth and time for a sick child to heal. Jake stopped at the edge of the town's main street, suddenly aware of what he was about to do. Cedar Gulch was civilized, which meant law, which meant sheriff's deputies and wanted posters and questions he couldn't answer without finding a rope around his neck. Walking into that town was like walking into a trap, but it was the only chance Cody Garrison had. "Dr. McAllister," Sarah whispered, seeing the medical shingle. "He delivered Cody, treated him when he had the croup last winter. He's a good man." Jake nodded, knowing that good men were exactly who he needed to avoid. Good men asked questions. Good men remembered faces. Good men turned outlaws over to the law even when those outlaws had saved a woman and child from dying in the snow. But Cody's breathing was getting worse, more labored, and there wasn't time for Jake's fears. He carried the boy into Dr. McAllister's office, Sarah following close behind, both of them dripping melted snow onto the clean wooden floors. Dr. McAllister took one look at Cody and went to work without asking questions. He was maybe 60, with gentle hands and eyes that had seen enough suffering to know it when it walked through his door. He laid Cody on a table, checking his breathing, his temperature, his pulse. "Lung fever," the doctor said after a few minutes, his voice grave but not hopeless. "Bad, but not too late. We can fight this, Mrs. Garrison. But the boy needs to stay warm, needs medicine, needs time to heal." Sarah's tears came then, relief and fear mixing together as she realized her son might live. "Whatever it costs," she whispered. "I'll find a way to pay." Jake reached into his coat, feeling the weight of the stolen money that had cost a good man his life. Blood money. Money that was supposed to buy his freedom, his passage to Mexico, his escape from everything he'd done wrong. He pulled out a thick roll of bills and laid it on the doctor's table. "This should cover it. Medicine, room and board, whatever they need until the boy's well." Dr. McAllister stared at the money, then at Jake's hard face, at the guns hanging from his belt, at the wanted posters he'd probably seen in the sheriff's office. "That's a lot of money, mister. More than most folks around here see in a year." "The boy needs it more than I do," Jake said simply. Sarah looked at Jake with new understanding, seeing past the weapons and the scars to the man underneath. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question. Nodded. "Law's after me. Has been for years. But that doesn't change what your boy needs." "Stay," Sarah said suddenly, urgently. "Cody will want to thank you when he's better. I want to thank you properly." Jake was already moving toward the door, knowing that every minute he stayed in Cedar Gulch was a minute closer to capture. "Can't. Posse's maybe a day behind me, maybe less. Don't want to bring that kind of trouble down on you and the boy." "What's your name?" Sarah called after him. "Please, I need to know the name of the man who saved my son's life." Jake stopped in the doorway, snow swirling around his boots, the night wind cutting through his coat. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, quietly, he said, "Jake Morgan. And Mrs. Garrison, tell the boy when he's older that sometimes the worst men do the best things. Tell him that matters." Jake Morgan walked back into the blizzard, leaving behind the warmth and safety he'd carried two strangers to find. His horse was gone, probably dead in the snow, which meant he'd be walking from now on. The money that was supposed to buy his freedom was gone too, spent on medicine for a child who'd never know his name. Behind him, through the doctor's window, he could see Sarah holding her son's hand while Dr. McAllister worked to save the boy's life. Cody was going to live, going to grow up, going to have chances that Jake, Blackjack Morgan, had thrown away years ago. The storm swallowed Jake whole, turning him into just another shadow moving through the white wilderness. The posse would catch up eventually, probably sooner than later. But for the first time in years, Jake wasn't running towards something. He was walking away from it, carrying the weight of one good choice in a life full of bad ones. Back in Cedar Gulch, Cody Garrison slept peacefully for the first time in days, his fever finally breaking as the medicine did its work. His mother sat beside his bed, holding his small hand, whispering prayers of thanksgiving for the outlaw who'd given up everything to save a child he'd never met. Sarah would tell her son the story when he was old enough to understand. She'd tell him about the man who chose mercy over freedom, who gave up his own salvation to save a stranger's child. She'd tell him that heroes don't always wear white hats, that sometimes they wear gun belts and carry blood on their hands. The posse found Jake's trail 2 days later, following his footprints through the snow until they disappeared into the high country where winter ruled with an iron fist. They searched for a week before giving up, deciding that the mountains had claimed another outlaw, that justice had been served by wind and snow and bitter cold. They found his hat beside a frozen creek, and nothing else. Sheriff Wade Garrison wrote in his report that Jake Blackjack Morgan was presumed dead, another casualty of a hard land that didn't forgive mistakes. The bounty went unclaimed, the wanted posters came down, and the case was closed. But high in the mountains, in a cabin that didn't appear on any map, an old prospector named Ezra Stone found a half-frozen man collapsed in his doorway. The man had no money, no horse, no papers, but he had a story about saving a woman and child from a blizzard, about choosing to do right even when it cost him everything. Ezra Stone had been living alone for 20 years, panning for gold that probably didn't exist, talking to himself and his mule when the silence got too heavy. He took the stranger in, nursed him back to health, never asked his real name or where he'd come from. Some things, Ezra figured, were better left buried in the snow. The man who'd once been Jake Blackjack Morgan stayed through the winter, working alongside Ezra, learning to find peace in simple work and quiet days. He never talked about his past, never mentioned the banks he'd robbed or the men he'd killed. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, he'd think about a little boy named Cody and wonder if good choices could balance out the bad ones. When spring came to the mountains, melting the snow and opening the passes, the stranger could have left, could have headed south to Mexico, changed his name, started over in a place where no one knew what he'd done. But he stayed, content to live quietly in the high country, earning his peace one honest day at a time. Years later, in Cedar Gulch, Cody Garrison grew up strong and healthy, with no memory of the night he'd almost died in a blizzard. But his mother made sure he knew the story, made sure he understood that sometimes angels come in unexpected forms, that sometimes the most broken people are capable of the greatest love. Every year on the anniversary of that terrible night, Sarah Garrison would place flowers on an unmarked grave in the Cedar Gulch Cemetery. The grave was empty, but it honored the memory of Jake Blackjack Morgan, the outlaw who'd traded his freedom for a child's life, who'd found redemption in a single moment of perfect choice. And high in the mountains, in a cabin that time forgot, 2 old men worked their claim and watched the sun set over peaks that had seen everything and judged nothing. One of them had once been an outlaw, but that life seemed as distant as the stars, as foreign as the man he'd been before he learned that sometimes the worst sinners make the greatest saints. Jake Blackjack Morgan had been running from God, but God had been patient, waiting in a blizzard, waiting in a child's fever, waiting in the choice between salvation and damnation. And when Jake finally stopped running, he found that mercy had been following him all along, as relentless as any posse, as certain as the sunrise over the mountains he now called home. The mountains kept their secrets, as mountains always do, but sometimes when the wind was right and the snow was deep, travelers claimed they could hear the echo of a choice that changed everything, the whisper of an outlaw who found his soul in the middle of a storm and decided that some things were worth more than freedom, more than gold, more than life itself. And in Cedar Gulch, now a grown man with children of his own, Cody Garrison would sometimes look toward the high country and wonder about the stranger who'd saved his life. He'd teach his own children about courage, about sacrifice, about the truth that heroes don't always wear white hats, that sometimes the greatest good comes from the most unexpected places. Partners, that's the tale of Jake Blackjack Morgan, the outlaw who found his soul in a blizzard. If this story moved you like it moved me, you better hit that like button and subscribe to Tony Tells Tales for more stories from the Old West. Drop a comment and tell me, do you believe one good deed can redeem a lifetime of bad choices? Until next time, keep your powder dry and your conscience clear. The story lived on, passed down through generations like a prayer, like a promise, like proof that even in the hardest times, in the darkest storms, there are people willing to choose love over fear, sacrifice over safety, redemption over damnation. Because sometimes, in the middle of a blizzard, an outlaw finds his way home.